Well, part of the problem with trying to understand the Bible is if you work from the fundamentalist level only, you end up becoming like Christopher Hitchens, who was a famous atheist, who made some obvious common sense points about God's behavior in these books. And we say, from our perspective, what's he doing? What's going on here? But a reading like that makes no attempt to get at the underlying principles. It may bring out some true things and some contradictions or apparent contradictions, but how do you get to what's unifying this whole book? Because this is a collection of several different books, of course, but what's unifying Scripture? What makes this God worthwhile? In other words, I shouldn't say that. Why should we worship a God like this? For instance, we're about to read about this strange episode in 2 Samuel in which David has a census, and this is considered a horrific sin. And the text is not clear why. Now, we'll talk about this more tomorrow when we read the rest of the story in 2 Samuel about the census that David takes. On the surface, it makes no sense. So that on the surface, you would say, if you were a Christopher Hitchens, this is an irrational God who's not worthy of our worship or our belief because he arbitrarily tells David not to take a census of his people, and he punishes the people severely because of the census that David takes, which we'll see. And he's right. From that level of interpretation, this makes no sense, and this is not a God you would even want to read about, much less believe in. Let's take a look, though, in trying to illustrate some of this. Let's take a look at what's happening here in Jeremiah. Remember from yesterday, many of the folks are now going to Egypt to hide from the Babylonians after Ishmael had killed Gedaliah the governor. And they come to Jeremiah and say, what does the God want us to do in this case? And it's pretty clear. God speaks through Jeremiah. But if ye say, we will not dwell in this land, neither obey the voice of the Lord your God, saying, no, but we will go into the land of Egypt, where we shall see no war, nor hear the sound of the trumpet, nor have hunger of bread, and there we will dwell. And now therefore hear the word of the Lord, ye remnant of Judah. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, if ye wholly set your faces to enter into Egypt and to go sojourn there, then it shall come to pass that the sword which ye feared shall overtake you there in the land of Egypt, and the famine whereof ye were afraid shall follow close after you there in Egypt, and ye shall die. On the surface, a Christopher Hitchens, who was an intelligent man and a passionate man, I mean, I used to be an atheist. I know how this works. And on the surface, you say, oh, so God, who's already punishing the people in Judah for their sins by allowing them to be overtaken by the Babylonians, he's going to punish them now if they try to run someplace safer and avoid the famine that's coming. Because remember, there's just utter chaos in the southern kingdom, Judah and Jerusalem at this point, especially now after the assassination of Gedaliah. They know there's going to be some sort of retribution from Babylon. They don't want to get slaughtered. Of course they're going to run to Egypt or someplace safe. Why would God prevent this? On that level, God's a monster, and he makes no sense. And yet, we know enough about Jesus and enough about the cultural influence of the faith, the good part of the cultural influence. A lot of people have done some horrible things in the name of religion, including the Christian faith. And yet we know that in general, the message of this book from Old and New Testament together is somehow mercy and something beyond mercy, the transcendence of love. And what we're seeing here in a bizarre way in Revelations, I'm not going to touch on much in Revelations today, if anything. Revelations 21 is the final chapter, and we're going to divide that up into short little segments and talk about it for the remainder of the semester. We know in general that God is love. I mean, that's what St. John tells us in one of his epistles. So how does that fit into a God who would punish the Israelites because of King David's census, and who would punish them for fleeing to Egypt? The Egypt thing, I think, can be explained. Egypt was always a symbol of complacency in, ow, that's my jaw, complacency in sin. Remember, the establishing story, or you might say the foundational myth of the people of Israel, is their having been led by Moses from Egypt into the promised land, which is a type, because Scripture is constantly repeating memes and themes. It's a type of escape from sin into the promise of joy, heaven, everlasting life. To return to Egypt means, symbolically at least, to say, I'm going to avoid the difficulties because I'm living in a very difficult time, and I'm going to flee to the place where we all used to be captive. I'm going to take about 10 giant steps back. It would be like you guys saying, I've had enough of Mr. O'Brien's class. I'm going to go take a class at Homeschool Connections that's for third graders. Even though third grade, I was smarter than all the other kids, I'm going back to third grade because it's so much easier. It's a retrogression. It's a reversal of the spiritual progress that the people of God are supposed to be making. Now, with that interpretation, it makes sense. It could be a wrong interpretation because the text doesn't spell it out, but it is an interpretation that works and fits into the overall structure of the Bible. The only other thing I want to point out to you today is from the Gospel, because I find it very interesting. This is not really anything that's symbolic. One of the fascinating things is how the Bible works at a literal and symbolic level. Jesus is being tortured and questioned. If you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God. Then they all said, are you then the Son of God? So he said to them, you rightly say that I am. And they said, what further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his mouth. Here you have a prophecy fulfilled within a verse or two. If I tell you the truth, you will by no means believe me. Are you the Son of God? Okay, I am. Ha! Now we've got him. Kill him. He must be committing blasphemy. We also know that Jesus is talking about what I would call sketosis, which is a word from a Greek root that means seeking darkness rather than light, and rejecting intelligence and wisdom. There are many indications that Jesus is, in fact, the Son of God. But that answer won't do. Even though the light has come into the world, people love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil, as St. John tells us in his gospel. People deliberately turn away. They have right there sitting before them light and truth, and yet they won't listen to the truth and they won't see by the light. So if you read the gospel from within, it makes sense. Otherwise, a Christopher Hitchens would say, well, of course they're going to kill him. He just claimed to be the Son of God. That's blasphemy for the Jews. You can't claim, because that means he himself has a divine nature as God's Son. Pagans believed that gods could father and mother humans or demigods or half humans, but for the Jews, that was terrible blasphemy. Well, then, if you're at that level, you're making the same mistake Jesus' tormentors are. So, with this and with all literature, don't just stop at the things that frustrate you. Don't just say, I don't get this census thing, because let me tell you, I don't either. We're coming to the end of the semester, and toward the end here of 2 Samuel, we've just heard the last words of David, and it looks like David's going to die, and okay, we're ready for it to end. Enough is enough. If you were with me last semester, we had all of 1 Samuel, and then we're given this whole thing about the census, which makes no census. The census makes no census. But bear with me. We're going to try to use what we know in general about reality and about this compiled work of literature called the Bible to interpret it in a way that, even though we might not totally understand it, and most people, commenters even, don't, we'll try to interpret that and everything in Scripture from the point of view of the wholeness of what we know, not just about the faith, but about life. Because what happens with Jesus right there that I just read, that's reality. This is how people behave. Look at the conspiracy theories and the unrealities that people are addicted to these days, and the falsehoods that they shove in the faces of their suffering neighbors because they won't have people accept their own choice as to what is real and true. And they won't even consider that there might be a God and that this book might operate on a much more difficult and challenging level than a Christopher Hitchens would want to believe. So let's not seek the darkness. Let's seek the light, even though it requires effort, as does living in Judah when you would rather go back to third grade in Egypt.